We,
We,
the
the
members
members
of
of
the
the
secret
secret
order
order of
of alchemical
alchemical
actors,
actors,
do
do
solemnly
solemnly
commit
commit
ourselves
ourselves
to
to
a
a
full and
full and
honest
honest
telling
telling
of the
of the
history
history
of
of
the
the
occult
occult
as
as
far
far
as
as
we
we
know
know
it.
it.
All right. What's up, Luke? We are back with another interview special. Dr. Heather Lynn is here today. Very excited about this, talking about the, I'm going to say this wrong, Annunaki, Annunaki. Luke, what's going on today?
Well, joining us today, as you had said, is Dr. Heather Lynn, professional historian and renegade archaeologist, on a quest to uncover the truth behind some ancient mysteries. Heather's work exposes hidden history, challenging some accepted narratives that we've all come to understand, that we might see within kind of the mainstream history books, as well as sharing her insights on, and if I say it wrong, I'm so sorry, the Anunnaki in her new book, The Anunnaki Revelation. Now, Heather, please correct us.
um, Anunnaki. That's good.
All right. See, Luke, of
Anunnaki.
course, you were closest to it.
Yes.
I'm
So
trying.
yeah. No, that's a good try. They are ancient gods of the Sumerian pantheon. So some of the more ancient gods that we actually have the names of.
That's awesome. Because my first question is going to be to give just kind of, before we start digging heavily into your book, maybe give a little bit of a brief overview as to who are the Anunnaki, just so we have a little bit of context, kind of whetting our palate.
So the Anunnaki are essentially the first set of gods that we have in history. And so obviously through prehistory, there's many different forms of spiritual beliefs and ways that they were presented. But the Sumerians literally start history because they were the ones that were able to write down the story of what happened. And that's because they had cuneiform, a method of writing that was using styluses that were shaped as a wedge, hence the cunei. And then they would press that into a clay tablet, and that tablet would be able to dry. And then because of that, we have so many different tablets to pull their mythologies from. It's estimated that there's about 500,000 cuneiform tablets right now in museums and universities, and many of which haven't been translated. But to compare that to what the Egyptian collection would be, given that they wrote on papyrus, that was more organic, and it didn't lend itself to the passage of time very well. And so we do know a lot about the ancient Egyptian gods and their beliefs, but if you can imagine, we know probably even more, at least have the potential to know more about the Sumerians. And so over time, though, that pantheon gave way to different invaders coming in and assimilating and taking over. And we end up having the Assyrians, Babylonians. And so it's from that broader Mesopotamian tradition. But initially, what I'm looking at with the Anunnaki are the oldest pantheon of those. So there's an initial sky god, as you could imagine. Very similar to the Greek pantheon. So you have like the Titans, you have 12 main gods that are also positioned on a mountaintop. And there's also lots of different gods that are lumped into that as Anunnaki, which are technically Anunnaki, but we don't really talk about them because they're not quite as popular. And a lot of times these are popular because of probably the most famous author who wrote about the Anunnaki would be Zechariah Sitchin. And he's an individual who, much like the late now von Daniken, came out with his alternative theory about what the Anunnaki were. And given his penchant for 1960s space sci-fi kind of stuff, he recalled the translations as being stories of ancient astronauts coming down to Earth, but literally in these metallic spaceships that had the nuts and the bolts. And he created an entire, I guess, lore of that. And that really, given the popularity of Chariots of the Gods, launched people into a new interest in the Sumerians. And so he could be credited with having them put out in the popular culture. It's interesting because we're familiar with people having what's called Egyptomania. A lot of people are enchanted by the Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian gods and whatnot, but they weren't necessarily feeling that with the Sumerians. And it was just a consequence of its difficulty translating. It wasn't as romanticized. It wasn't in films the same way, but it was there. And so the 1970s saw this big push into people looking back at the Sumerians and saying, that's interesting. And then, of course, with television shows like Ancient Aliens and things like that, it's further pushed the Sumerians and the Anunnaki out into the zeitgeist. And so that's kind of a little bit about the general idea of what the Anunnaki are from that perspective. What they are, though, technically and actually is just the Mesopotamian, mostly Sumerian pantheon of gods.
Okay, so within that pantheon, and as you said, we'd have to kind of look back at some of the cuneiform tablets and break those down a little bit more. And you had mentioned it's just not quite as romanticized. Do you think that is just because of our lack of knowledge, that difficulty in translating these tablets?
It's a little twofold, I would say. Yes, because of that, although now it's not as difficult. It's definitely something that people can do, but there is, a supply and demand thing. There's not many people who can do it. And there's now more hope on the horizon because of using artificial intelligence to ramp that process up, that perhaps they'll be able to have more of those translations. But leading up to that, the actual just manpower, if you will.
Mhm.
It was because primarily when they were discovered, first of all, they couldn't interpret them or translate them right away. Over time, when they did, they started to discover some things that were problematic. And that is because the individuals who were finally sort of wrapping their minds around what was being said were part of a sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian era that was permeated with like puritanical type, just Christian belief sets. And what they saw were a lot of the Bible stories that would be in what we would understand as the Bible um, were actually pushed back much further. And that was a little threatening. So something like, for instance, Noah's Ark is a classic example. We have Noah's Ark, running around with this family on a big boat with all the animals of the world. But if you look at the Sumerian account, it's much older and more specific, and it's almost identical, but with very, very specific changes and differences in it. Either way, regardless of those differences, it pushes the timeline back a lot. You have this like repeatedly with sort of threatening Bible stories. And so that worldview would be threatening to the population. Now, the academics at the time who were looking at this, they were not necessarily threatened, but it wasn't necessarily either kept as a secret, so to speak, but it was just not well advertised.
Mhm.
It was need to know basis. And it was just a different time too, where people weren't out there having like, science communicators and public speaking. It was just, okay, so we're researching this. And so it was sort of hidden, sort of just not, and it became more romanticized though later once it was that, okay, well, maybe we don't know these translations, maybe there's something to it. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in the translations too.
Was this region more inaccessible? Because I'm thinking like also like of Hinduism, like Manu and the
Mm,
legends of the flood there. Like Blavatsky, like England just conquered it, right? And so we
mm,
could access India for all this time period, and
right.
Egypt was accessible. And we're sending all these researchers down there, and like they're I don't know researchers, adventurers, right? Explorers pulling out mummies and things.
Yeah, right.
Was this region like of the world just like we couldn't get to it? I don't actually know like about the 19th century and
Oh no, that's a great
really.
point because it was a little bit of that. It was not necessarily as inaccessible, I would say, but the same thing was going on, and it was, and I talk about this in the new book as well, the Anunnaki Revelation, because it's very important to understand in the history of archaeology at the time. Um, Archaeology has this nice reputation of being a science and it's ethical, et cetera. Well, maybe now, but when it began, it certainly wasn't, and it was not even a scientific discipline at all. It was a rich man's hobby called antiquarianism. And so what they did was they'd go around who had the money to do these things, right? So a great example is the individual who funded the excavation of King Tut's tomb was actually the actual Lord Grantham, Lord, who was, if anybody has ever watched Downton Abbey, the owner of Highclere Castle. So the actual owner of Highclere Castle, Downton Abbey, was the one who funded King Tut's whole excavation because, well, he had the money too. He was interested. And what he did, though, with it was he brought it back to the castle and made a cabinet of curiosities, which was essentially a room, a mini museum that other people could come and take a look at the cool artifacts, maybe chomp on a mummy or something. They were known to do. So this is what was going on. Well, at the time, though, now we're also having a turn of the century with the war. We're having a lot of just different social upheavals and people questioning the system a lot more, especially when their sons are going to die on the front lines and they're looking at this gentry class and they're looking at the idea of socialism and saying, things need to be different. And so but the antiquarians, a lot of them saw the writing on the wall and said, we need to formalize this a little differently. maybe we'll just give our things to museums that are open to the public, and we'll still be able to do our thing, but we'll just reform it, and we'll, whatever. So it really came out of that. And even to this day, when you go to museums, you'll see, an artifact, and the little label beside it will say, "and generous donation by the such and such family," or "on loan," or sometimes they're on loan for large extended periods and they don't belong to the museum. It's because there was this big, essentially looting of all these cultures that was put into a science. And so now the problem now we have is that a lot of people in archaeology cling to the science idea and forget that it's still a soft science. Maybe they're using scientific tools and scientific methodology, and when those tools get even more high tech with LiDAR and things like that, it creates a veneer of some sort of like actual quantifiable fact coming out of the research, when in fact it's still dependent on a qualitative analysis, or at least mixed methods. And so that's where we get this tension now. And I think it's falling apart in a lot of ways with this so-called mainstream narrative. And then you have people who are coming out as like pseudo archaeologists, and you have this tension built up where, maybe at first it was a clear divide where it's like, this is the academic, industrial complex, this is what's coming out of it. Then there's the pseudo archaeologist, or, the people who've always been doing those alternative ideas. But now I think that's sort of that dichotomy is breaking a little bit. But essentially that area was difficult to access, but politically. And then during that same time where antiquarianism is turning into archaeology, there was a great opportunity there by the governments, particularly in Britain, to use it as espionage. And that's where we get most of those early people who are into art, like Gertrude Bell and Lawrence of Arabia, so to speak. You get all these individuals who go there, and they're going there to do research and to, culturally connect, but they were really actually on the book spies. And what they were doing, as they were referred to as kingmakers, were going in, stirring up problems in the Middle East, trying to figure out who they could prop up as leaders, trying to reform the maps as they've done, and create a lot of different problems that we're still living with today, which has created even more problems, of course, over all of that course from that time that they interjected themselves to now, making the field of, say, Mesopotamian archaeology less accessible than ever before, because it just simply has to do with the political landscape. So yes, the landscape and terrain is difficult, but it's the political landscape that's been harder to traverse.
Sure.
Kind of building off of that a little bit, and this is a question that's farther down in the document, but I feel like it's a bit of a natural transition here. Is there an element of danger to kind of pursuing this research that you experienced while you were compiling this information for your book?
Yeah, actually.
Without giving too much away from the book, because I think you're alluding to it a bit there.
I give the I can give the whole book away. I don't mind. People still buy, but I'm not one of those gatekeepers. So it's more. Yes, there's danger. There's definitely danger, and it's not. It doesn't come from where you may initially think. There's the obvious danger of just travel, but the maybe lesser danger is what I found out. At least when I first got into this, I didn't realize the depths of it. I didn't realize how passionate people were about the question about the Anunnaki or any of this. And so what I found were there are individuals who have a vested interest in finding out this history, and they will really stop at nothing to connect themselves to the greater narrative. And so some of those dangers are probably even less about going to the region and more about encountering the individuals who want to shape that narrative. And there's also a strange, because there's an ideological bent to it, and there's also a strange association too with one artifact in particular. It's kind of romanticized, like the spear of, destiny or whatever, but it's very much the tablet of destinies. And sometimes people refer to it as the tablets of destiny, but it's not. It's the tablet of destinies, and it's just this legendary object. But there is an interest in finding this particular thing. And it's believed by some that this tablet, what it may have is like instructions to something that has some sort of code, information. So the tablet itself is not necessarily magical in and of itself, but that it has some sort of secret knowledge on it. And so that's where the danger comes into play, because there are people who are very interested in finding these things and since it's wrapped up too with currently even with espionage, it's as you could imagine, a sticky situation.
If anything, though, it furthers the value of the research you're doing. If someone is willing to go to the extent, it just shows how important this is in
I
kind of
think
fully
so.
understanding the Anunnaki themselves.
I think so, and that's what I learned over the years. Was I was a little bit interested just because I was into the stuff overall, but I initially came across it when I was looking into an excavation that came out or was publicized in about 2012, I want to say, and it was the first that had been done in the region for quite a long time because of the war. And it was at the University of Manchester, and I wrote about it on a blog, and a lot of people had questions, and they were like, "Are they looking for stargates?" And I'm like, probably not, but I want to find out. so I contact I'm going through the proper channels, and I contact the university, and I say, "Can I interview?" Well, first of all, it was a press release, so they wanted press. So I said, "Can I interview the professor?" And they're like, "Sure, pass along the questions," and had an appointment and everything. And I passed along the questions. And one of the questions, I said, "Hey, people are interested. Are there such things as stargates? Have you found anything?" And I don't remember. I put it in a report and I put in the email so people could see that it wasn't like a total whack job email. I just put it in there. Hey, I took questions from my audience and this is something they'd like to ask. And I was ghosted immediately. And I was like, all right, I get it, but I don't, because I'm not that way. I feel like I'll answer anything. And I encountered this when I was teaching, that something I didn't realize, which was a lot of professionals were like, I don't want to talk unless I'm getting paid. Like I'm not a consultant for free. This kind of attitude that just I didn't understand. So like it was always my idea that if you maybe came across an artifact or something interesting, responsibly, you should take it to your local museum or university, and then they would be there to help you out. I didn't realize that that wasn't necessarily the case with these like careerist academicians. And so, but I found that out. And so I thought, okay. But now I got curious about the money. I was like, okay, well, who's funding this? What's going on with this? And then I got an email from somebody locally, because again, I had been putting this on a blog, and so I was getting attention. And they said they're taking out artifacts, and they're very mad about it. And I was like, So when I looked into it, I found that the major investor in the whole project was a big oil company with ties to families in the United States. The second biggest investor was an individual who was the heir to the Thyssen family dynasty. And why that was important, other than it was an individual, was because he was one of the largest collectors of antiquities of Mesopotamian origin, primarily, second to Queen Elizabeth II. And I thought, that's a conflict of interest if I've ever seen one. And then I saw some of the reports were given, not publicly or at the university even, but given to the board at this oil company. And I'm like, this is just not sitting well with me. And so I start doing deep dives into it. And instead of then asking like, okay, are there stargates? I started thinking, what is a stargate? Let me ask different questions. And I try to get in the minds of the individuals who may be looking into these things. And that's when I first, of course, encountered Sitchin and these other ideas. But then I saw other people would contact me who had like incredible credentials, who were very interested in this. So my approach was always like inquisitive. And then I come at it this way. There's enough evidence for me to know 100% that there are individuals in positions of power and abilities that have huge interest in finding out these questions. Therefore, it's important, because whether it's real or not, it doesn't matter, because if somebody has that much power to affect my life or our lives collectively, and this is their ideology or mindset, it's worth knowing. So we'll judge whether it's all real later. First, I want to find out, is this really going on? What's happening? And then that once I removed that sort of barrier of skepticism from myself, then it was just like, open the floodgates, man. And everything came in, and it's just been, so that's why there's this leap from like the Anunnaki connection, the first book, where I'm sort of just like walking people through, where I'm connecting the dots to this, to the tried and true problem nobody wants to probably end on a book with, which is I had more questions than answers. And so, but I did. And then that's when the next book comes out, because it's kind of a compilation of like, okay, now we're getting to this is crazy. And so that's why it goes into some of the less, the more, I guess, occult areas of it, the more magical context of the so-called Anunnaki. So, yeah, long story short. long story, much longer than it needed to be. But yeah, that's how I came to that. But I think it is important, and I know that other people think it's important too. So, which just piques my curiosity even more.
Mhm. Well, because you had mentioned it, do you mind if we kind of explore let's say, the more magical elements of the Anunnaki?
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about how, compared to the Apkulu of ancient Mesopotamia, and hopefully I said Apkulu correctly, Apkalu.
Apkalu.
Okay. Compared to the Apkalu of ancient Mesopotamia, uh, who, are bringing wisdom to humanity, what role did the Anunnaki have relative to that? Like, how were they providing wisdom to this early forms of civilization?
So that's something that I think I have made everybody mad with, because in this little discipline, if you will, you'll have the people who are the cult of personality with Sitchin, who are like, no, aliens all the way. They came bloop, bloop, bloop on spaceships, and they're here to like get our gold and go back to their home planet. You got that whole thing. Then you get to people who are more like, I won't even say Flint Dibble, if anyone who knows who that is, because they're not even going to bother to take the time to talk about it. So you'll get the ones like Michael Heiser, who's passed, but Michael Heiser had a whole website called sitchiniswrong.com. And while he wasn't right, and while he was a great academic, okay, he could actually read the tablets, and no problem there. The problem was he didn't necessarily overtly come out and tell us that he was an evangelical Christian with his own agenda. And so he would go on all these like 700 Club style televangelist stuff, talking about, the Nephilim and whatever. And that's fine. But again, that's your choice. It's like either, that or that. And so or they're not real at all, or shut up about it. It's just like God's like everything else. And that's not what I found. And that's not where I was happy dwelling. And so I tried to look at it in a different way. And I went back to the original text and just read them and believed the ancients. Like, don't doubt their story. Understand that they weren't writing for us. They were writing for each other. And probably most of this came from oral tradition to begin with. And so we're talking about an amalgamation of events and lots of different things. But I was looking at the details. And in some of those details, you see, back to the idea of like the Noah's Ark story being older and different. Those details, though, that's where the devil is. And so, for instance, in that, the original Noah story doesn't talk about the flood survivor being one individual who got word from God and then gathered up his family, got a boat and all these animals. Instead, it says that the reason this Noah character knew about the cataclysm was because this individual was an astronomer and a great scientist, and they could see the signs in the sky. Upon learning that, they went out and got all of the heads of all of the arts and science disciplines with the intent to make a breakaway with civilization. Then what they did was they got all the animals of the steppe, very clearly listed, not every animal on the earth, all the animals of the steppe. And so when you look at it that way, what comes about, in my view, is something like somebody saw something happening and they were literally making a nomadic breakaway civilization in order to survive. And you would take the animals of the steppe because that would keep you alive. They were the ones that we understand now at the Eurasian steppes, where, if you want to get by, you can slice, sadly enough, you cut the throat of or not the throat, that's actually the opposite. Sorry, I've been talking a lot of ball lately for people, and we've been talking about sacrifice, so that's on the mind. You would not cut the throat of the poor animal, not in this case if you want it to live, which was the point. You would make a slight cut so that you could bleed the animal while still keeping the animal alive. And this is a tradition that's still done in nomadic peoples like this, so that you could have the nutrition, but still keep the livestock. That's also where you get cheese and different products that way. So if you got the animals of the steppe, those were domesticated, they were able to graze along the way, it would just be a better option for you than, getting a boat and getting a bunch of like lions together or something. So they come, and what they're doing is they're traveling to find dry, different grounds to live. In the Sumerian text, it discusses these individuals as meeting with the people who are called the black-headed ones and the Adamah. And the black-headed ones, well, two things to consider. One, if they themselves didn't have dark hair, then why would they point that out? That seems important. So we're looking at some sort of difference in peoples. but the individuals who the semi-settled hunter-gatherers at the time, they had dark hair. The archaeological record shows that they reached about 5 foot tall at best, which makes sense. And they also had burial evidence of their bodies being painted in red ochre. So the Adama, the way that translated in the earliest was like specifically the red clay of the earth, which in Abrahamic tradition, then you'll often see as God is fashioning man out of the clay of the earth, and that's how that goes. But in this reading, it points to something more literal, like these individuals that they already encountered that were there happened to be red. And you would see the particular land has a very, very specific red ochre to it. And that was known to be used in funerary rites and whatnot. So in my view, what you see is a meeting of climate refugees that are coming in to semi-settled hunter-gatherers who have, cultural practices of painting themselves with red ochre, who have dark hair, who don't speak the same language, who have a different class. And we see a cargo cult thing happen where they see these so-called shining ones as the gods, and these individuals subjugate them, which this is all laid out. But Sitchin will say these were aliens that came and made a slave species of the gods. They were meant to do it. It kind of works, but it doesn't at the same time. So if you strip the Star Wars aspect from it and you read what the text says, it actually does in depth go into how these individuals subjugated them, forced them to dig irrigation canals, and taught them how to do agriculture, but enslaved them in doing so. And it also had rules about how to instill worship through burnt offerings, how to they weren't against breeding. There was no breeding. It was no going in between these two. And then there was the priest class that was established. So the language barrier was there so that you would have to, in order to speak to the gods who were up at their false mountaintop, their temple, you would have to go to the priest first and then have that sort of basically what we start to see with the Sumerians is the first start of social stratification, hierarchy. And you see that bear out in the actual evidence as well with they're the ones that are credited with starting professions, work weeks, time systems, weights, measures, the whole nine. So we're looking at like some people will say that's where civilization started, but I would argue that according to them, it's where it restarted because of the dating to the Younger Dryas impact event, that perhaps if you listen to what they said, there was a flood and, different things could happen. The people's idea of the world is going to be narrowed by their particular experience of it. But it does seem to align with this notion that there could have been an antediluvian society that made a breakaway civilization, appeared as gods to the semi-settled hunter-gatherers that were in the region, subjugated them, and then that hierarchy broke down over time as it would as people assimilate. And then we get this story that's a sort of vestigial memory of how they came to be. But that doesn't explain the mystical aspect of these Apkallu. And that's important because when you Google Anunnaki, you'll see a lot of different things, including these entities that have bird faces and wings, and they're holding pine cones, and they have like these wristwatches. And it's like, those are Anunnaki, but they're not. And the texts say otherwise. The texts really clearly point to the Anunnaki themselves, especially the earliest ones, as being humans, whereas they had almost like a spiritual system that they had themselves called, they had different rites, but these Apkallu specifically were termed semi-biological entities, and they were associated with the Pleiadian star system. So completely different. We're having like two narratives now. We have like the one narrative that Sitchin and people really focus on, but in my view, that's more of a human element. The weirdness comes from what seems to be something that was imported, just like the language. So Samuel Noah Kramer, a scholar, dubbed this the Sumerian problem. And that's something that I think has led to its mystique, which is that there, aside from the fact that this so-called civilization happened within 200 years, which is wild, you have the fact that the Sumerian language is a language isolate, meaning it's just not related to any other language in the region or anywhere known. And so it's mysterious. Like, well, what were they speaking? Who are these people? We just don't know. So when you consider that language brings culture, carries all of those memories and things too, then it would make sense why when you look at the Sumerian text, there's these like weird other things mixed in that aren't quite accounted for that later get like assimilated out and then you have Babylonian, and it just kind of goes in a different direction. So I tried to pull at the threads of the most ancient parts of it, and that's where I found the Apkallu, who were essentially spiritual but could go between realms, who came out of the ocean, who came from the sky, and who could be contacted through these different ways, of, like, say, altered states. And in the tablets, it shows that in the early days, each king was designated one of these celestial sages. And it was through this, like, Hulgil anointing rite that they would have their minds open to this. And then they could have the divine right to rule because they were in correspondence then with an entity. And that was like the tradition. So how that gets read, I mean, there's many ways to view that now. And that's what I try to look at by taking away, to the best of my ability, the words and trying to find the common ground, whether it's, like, you could say angels, demons, aliens, clockwork elves, archons, whatever. Some looking at the phenomenology of it, like, what were these ancient kings communing with and doing, or what were they claiming was happening? And that's where a lot of people are interested in anyway. They want to know, like, where were they getting technologies? That's, I think, technology is key with the Anunnaki question for most people. Bloodlines and technology.
So, as far as these kings who were communing, you'd mentioned the Apkallu wearing these wristwatches, and just for clarity, they're not actual watches for anyone who's like listening and confused, but they were the rosette of the poppy, correct?
Yes. That's
Yeah.
that's important to point out that they're not watches, because you'll find people have emailed me and said, you have no idea what you're talking about. They were actually Apple Watch type. That's where we get the prototype. They're secret government programs. I'm like,
Of course, it's
hold
got to
on,
be that.
back it up.
Apple Watch. They weren't a Timex? Come on.
I mean, yeah. So
But
no, that's good. Those are the ones too. When you Google them, you do see those, and they were like poppies.
yeah, because you can think about the connection with opium, especially if you are a king having access to a vast amount of things. Delving into opium or using like a psychedelic, for example, might have been what led to that kind of communing with the gods.
Yes, and I think that was key, actually, because the first thing that kind of pulled me in that direction was, of course, Allegro's Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And while he tried to propose that Christianity was essentially a mushroom cult, the first part of the book really goes into Sumerian etymology and the origins of it being a lot older than just Christianity. But he pulls on that thread, but he doesn't necessarily go deep into it. And I think he even says in the first chapter or so that he plans to go further into that, but he never did. So I looked at that and thought, okay, let me see where he was going with this and see if there's anything now that, if we have anything in the scholarship that could support that. And there were some things that the translations weren't quite right on. But again, I don't feel that these days everybody should get so hung up on the translation aspect of things, because there's translation and there's interpretation. A lot of Sitchin's translations were correct, and not because he translated them, but because they were known already. That's another misnomer, is that he was the only one who cracked the code, and that's not true. They existed. But then there's interpretation. So, like, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? So two sides of a similar coin. So while the translation aspect is important, I wanted to look for anything at all that could support his thesis in the material sense. And what I found was mushroom tablets, which was totally surprising to me. They were tablets that, okay, so when I say tablets, it's easy to think of like old Charlton Heston holding up giant tablets, and no, they had very small tablets. So that's why you may be able to hear these numbers like, okay, museums have like 500,000 of them. It's like, well, because they're small. But they're usually rectangular. They're tablet-like. These in particular, these mushroom tablets, are named such because they are shaped like mushrooms, and they have the cuneiform writing going all the way around them. And what they were saying would be just prayers or laments or things meant for the gods to hear only. And those tablets, those little mushrooms, would be plugged in to the temple walls and areas. So this kind of gives us the notion that they did see the mushroom as an intermediary between the gods, that they could communicate through the mushroom in particular. So that's one clue that was interesting. Another is, and you mentioned the poppy, is the fact that they had, since they wrote everything down, it's estimated about 660 medical texts that are also priest texts, they had exorcisms and medical rites all kind of mixed into one. They didn't separate those two, but they had recipes for different plant medicines and different potions and salves, what have you, lots of it. And so some of those we don't know the contents of because of the translation issue. Other things we do. And there's one plant called the whole gill, and that is the joy plant. And that is the poppy. Now, it sort of wasn't talked a lot about with this poppy. It's just sort of an afterthought. But what really brought into my mind was this wristwatch of the gods thing. So because everybody's like, oh, it's Apple Watches. So I'm like, all right, we got to look into that. What are these things? So
the Apkalu have their Apple Watches. They have their little iPad mini mushroom tablets.
Yeah, I mean, they're real high tech.
They're really into the Apple ecosystem.
They're playing Super Mario, man. They got those mushrooms, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh, exactly, right?
Why not? They had a Super Nintendo.
Yeah, super. So they had that, and I was like, where are these watches? What are these things? I did find, okay, so when we talk about hoards being found and looting and all of that, unfortunately, in 1989, local Iraqi professors found the biggest stash, the biggest find of gold aside from King Tut, which is huge. I mean, and the artifacts were beautiful, perfectly preserved in some cases, and they found them without Western intervention. And this was 1989. So we're talking, it's already like a problem's brewing. So thankfully, though, the professor, he took a picture of everything and cataloged every find, analyzed them in both English and Arabic, put it in a book, and it's available through the University of Chicago. But that was it, because then the Desert Storm, the war happened. Then we have a subsequent, bunch of problems happening with the looting in the museum. And at the end of the day, a lot of these artifacts were put into bank vaults that lost. Some of them were found, but part of that hoard were actually the wristwatches of the gods. And I was able to locate a picture of them that I have in the book. It's a little underwhelming because it's in black and white, but I have it on my website and other places because it really should be seen in color. They're beautiful. The carving is so intricate. It looks like something that, is shocking to people that they could even have done that, which, because we never give the ancients any credit. So we were like shocked that they could make something so nice. But what goes around it, the cuff is a scene of these Apkallu who are doing this magic ritual. And then you have little poppies and all that. And I say they're poppies because for a long time, you see this repeated motif in this art. And it was told that, well, they're just maybe like florets, or sometimes they're date palms, sometimes they're pomegranates. There's all those things. But in the pomegranate one, I could see it maybe because they have this little pod shape with the little top, but he's holding them and they're like branches with all these pomegranates. And it's like, just the size doesn't seem right, but that's what they are according to mainstream academia. But in this particular Iraqi professor's work and all of the local work, they say without a doubt, just, oh, it's poppy. And when you see this discovery was the tomb of Nimrud, and it was the queen's tomb. There are multiple queens there, and in it was like confetti made of gold that were all these little poppy flowers, and then the actual like icons that they use are identical to the pod of the opium poppy right before it is ready to be cultivated for the latex within. And so they said it like I looked at it and tried to understand what flower is this. And it did kind of look like that, but it could look like a lot of pods. But then this professor was like, oh, and this is the poppy, this is that poppy, and poppy everywhere. And we know the poppy's importance in the region. And for some reason, maybe lost in laws, I don't know. I don't even know why. It went from in the journals, it was poppy, to it could be dates, it could be just pretty pictures. They completely erased the poppy component. So I'm just simply bringing that back into the question and saying, okay, but now I'm looking at, okay, but what about poppy? Like how long had it been cultivated? And, and there's evidence for it going back very far. We used very far, and along with other ones too, in different mixtures that could be salves and different things that could be ritualized or even just medicinal, which they didn't distinguish between those two, by the way. They were both. So it was like The Exorcist was an early physician who was doing diagnostics. That's why you had to know the name of the demon. It was, symptoms, and then this demon would respond through this way of, we would put this salve on them, or maybe this libation or magic spell, but it wasn't a body mind disconnect. It was the same thing.
I wonder if it's, and this is very like speculative, I wonder if it's almost whitewashing is not the correct term in this instance, but let's call it drug wash. Like to remove the poppy like from context because of the negative stigma that's associated
Mhm.
with it.
I can get you a drug wash, Luke. I can get you a cheap drug wash. They do them around the corner here.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, yeah. It's
That's
legal in the state now.
I think that's probably the best way I've heard it talked about, because yeah, I mean, if you think about too, when this all kind of fell out of the vernacular, it was around the war on drugs that time. So I would say that's probably, and we've seen that happen anyway. But yeah, because it just seems so strange that it was just a given that this was poppy, and then why would we go backwards and start saying, well, it could be a date, it could be, and that's not a date, it could be, why, why change it, why whitewash it or drug wash it? But I think that is what happened. Yeah,
I mean, were like Leary or McKenna picking this up and running with it at all?
I've not seen that, not with regard to and again, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Sumerian mythology and a lot of this just hasn't been in the zeitgeist as strongly as Egyptian. And so I think, though, if McKenna was around now, he'd be on that. Like, I really do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is right up his alley, isn't it?
I want to get a better idea of some of the Anunnaki's power, and you kind of allude to them having this connection with death and transhumanism and immortality, and I want to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so that's so it kind of like, I don't know where to begin with that, because there is that element, because it's like, I joke that this was like an Anunnaki fever dream, because it just does get like, how do we pull all these things together? We got like secret societies and AI and all, but like it does oddly fit together, and it fits together. I think the culmination of which has to do more with the quest for technology and power. I think this is ultimately a story of power, because if you just think about it, if we were to take my thesis seriously, more of a hypothesis, but if you take that seriously and you consider these first Anunnaki as being humans that have this whole power structure, and then they impose a power structure in the way of civilization onto people, then what we're talking about is just the beginnings of this like quest for power. What was it that gave them that leverage for power? Well, it was their knowledge, it was their science, their technology, the words that they used. That was how they differentiated themselves from the others. They were humans like the others, but there's always that knowledge is power thing. So likewise, I think that the quest has been constantly to try to find the leverage that could be used to get that level of power. And the ultimate technology would then be life extension technology. You see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh and other stories of that time where that was the ultimate goal anyway. So you have just the natural human tendency to want to have power, and in that ultimate power live forever. But then you have what I saw happen on the practical ground, which would be this. Now, this is where it gets a little weirder. This is where you have this Apkallu question again. So say we're considering that the ancient so-called gods or the Anunnaki were people, or you had kings or anyone in a position of power, but they were getting their divine right to rule from some unseen force that they only could tap into through these shamanic ways. So things like music, orgiastic behavior, like maybe drum circles or even sometimes actual orgies, drugs. So like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, essentially. And so they were doing this and coming into this knowledge. Okay, so first you have to ask, well, how would that give you knowledge other than just like the hippie said, it expands your consciousness, right? But we don't listen to that. How do we know that like just getting high gives you any kind of real expansion? Well, we don't know, but we can infer, because there's a lot of people who you wouldn't suspect of having those claims actually say that's where they get their knowledge. So a lot of people discovered things in dreams, a lot of mainstream scientists, even Nikola Tesla and people like that. And then you have to say, well, it could be fable, sure, but let's look at just the basic idea of what it is to be inspired or have a muse. I mean, the Latin for comes from, the inspired comes from the Latin inspirare, and it was a specific meaning of a god blowing an idea or imparting an idea into you. So even with that idea of saying, well, I'm just inspired, you're still giving credit to some unseen force just moving you without your will or intent. So it's something at a phenomenological level that we just don't really have an ability to understand. We just get ideas. And so if you can engage in an activity that makes you even more creative or makes other ideas come into your mind, then that is a way to get technology, and like a new ager say like a download or something, right? So you have this though a lot described with the use of DMT and substances like that, where people specifically, they don't just get high and feel relaxed or see like a little like color or something. Instead, they have these experiences that often match other experiences that other people have had either throughout time or at the same time, if take into consideration Strassman's work and all of that. But specifically the experience of encountering an entity that some say are tricksters, some say, a lot of things about, but the entity will often try to show you a thing. And if you're open to it, it will show you something. And that something is usually some sort of life-changing information, whether it's about you personally or sometimes with enough visits, some sort of technology or an idea that's like highly advanced. And that is something that a lot of people have described happening through meditation, through ancient practices, and now through DMT. And even in the experiments now, they're trying to do extended state research to see if you could put a person under and like try to get them in there for so long to say, okay, what did you see? What did you learn? What technology or insight can you bring back? And so with that said, it's more of a question, I think, of how can you get power in a way that is just different than, say, education or learning something, but just how can I have an edge on others? So you see this now coming about in the sense of, technocrats and individuals who are unapologetic, trying to tap into something to have this like transhumanist sort of experience. Because in the end, that's what it is. You're trying to go above and beyond. You're trying to become like an Ubermensch. You're trying to have apotheosis or ascension or whatever like buzzword you want to use. And so you have a great interest in learning how to do that. But likewise, you have the artificial intelligence component coming into it, which it's different than just like, hey, it's big Google, because it's just not how it operates. It's not a search engine. It is an intelligence. It's a disembodied intelligence. Now, you can go on a whole ethical thing or philosophical thing about, is it a being? Does it have feelings? Is it a soul, et cetera? But at bare minimum, we know that it is externalized intelligence. And so that right there now you can see, and I argue this in another book that I have coming out like soon, which is that civilization is the first artificial intelligence that we know of, because within it operates each node, and that you're externalizing your skills, you're externalizing intelligence. And that's what the tablets in cuneiform and writing are. It's like trying to put that out there so there's a sense of permanence. And so it's not unnatural for there to be artificial intelligence. It's something that is like the general course of how we are going to evolve to externalize our intelligence. And I think that is deeply connected to this like Anunnaki Apkallu question, because it's the same thing. It's just in a new format. So if there is a chance at getting, say, new downloads, if you will, or new inspiration or new ways to rearrange ideas, then artificial intelligence may be the way to, say, give body to that externalized intelligence. And I don't know that, I'm not claiming that that's great or that that's going to happen, or I'm just saying that I know that there's individuals who see it as a hope and a promise of a new age.
I mean, it makes me think of like the question of like higher intelligence or lower intelligence, right? Like, I mean, particularly when you're making the comparison with artificial intelligence, which is fascinating. I think, like Chalmers and consciousness folks, right, get into this idea of maybe it's external, right? And,
Right.
Maybe an anthill or a beehive, has this kind of like collective intelligence. But like with artificial intelligence, I think the main concern right now is that it becomes slop, right? That rather than raising us up to the highest thought, it's going to drag us down to the lowest thought. So yeah, I mean, could you talk about that, like in terms of how are the Anunnaki, trying to like elevate rather than lower through this externalization?
Well, that's giving those unseen forces the credit that they do want to elevate, and I just don't know that that's the case, because
Uh,
if you look at the history of what these discarnate entities may be, uh, it's often neutral. So it's only been recently that we have that clear distinction between angels and demons, right? They were all daemons, or they're all angels, but maybe some are fallen. There's all these different ways to look at it, but at the end of the day, even the modern ones that people encounter through these like DMT experiences, because I've asked every single psychonaut I could, are they good or are they bad? Like, tell me, are these demons or are these like good guys? What is it? Every single person, surprisingly, every single one has said, depends. They're like us. There's good ones, there's bad ones. It just depends. But the
mm,
one thing is they're tricksters. So the trickster archetype, I feel, is really the key. So if that's the case, and then you see this too with like people with occult practices where they have egregores, and that there depends on what you're bringing to it. So it could be positive, it could be negative. So it's that. So I think with AI, it's the vessel that could channel the thing. So that's why I think it's so dangerous, is because it's powerful, and then you're going to have to say, well, is it going to raise us up? If it had the potential, and maybe this is just me being cynical, but in my view, if it has the potential to raise us up, then that's not the version the hoi polloi will get.
mm,
Well, because again, it's always about power. It's about that priest class. It's about that Enki Enlil dynamic of there's, the knowledge is power and will subjugate others to maintain our position as gods. And then
mhm,
there's the ones that are like, no, everyone should have this knowledge or have access to this knowledge so that we can all become gods, or however that may be. And so I think that at its heart is the battle that we're always facing. Some can call it the battle between good and evil. Some can, whatever you want to frame it as with your culture and ideas. But at the end of the day, it's a power struggle. And so AI is just, I think, the battlefield that this will be played out in, and we'll see what happens. But I do think it has the potential to raise people up, but I think it has the potential to do the opposite as well, and it will be determined on who leverages it. And it's just like the using it for translation thing. So like they're using it to translate some Sumerian tablets and other things, and I was interested, of course, in that and some of the schools that were saying they were doing it. When I looked into it, I noticed they all, because always follow the money. I noticed they were all getting money from the same source, kind of variously. Like they would get money from the university, who would have a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, but where did they get the money? Because it was all happening at the same time. I saw there's one global organization called the Transatlantic Platform who wanted to just do this, and then they give money down and it trickles down. And so by the time it gets in the hands of the actual, university, it's not, they're not involved. But when you trace it all the way up, it does come from one centralized source. That to me is a problem, because what if it's not the right translation? What if the person who is feeding the data set in is biased or has an agenda? How do we know? And so I think that's where the problem is going to be. It's such a powerful tool that it's it's so powerful that we're going to probably just get the slop, and other people are going to have such leverage that'll make them like the gods.
mm, 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 mm.
It always makes me worry because it makes me think of the possibility, and I don't think this is going to occur, in my opinion, of like a singularity type event. And if it were to occur, it wouldn't, as you said, be given out to the public. That'd be something
Yeah.
that'd be held back in very specific places and used for specific powers to do whatever they deem fit, and not necessarily to the betterment of society.
Right. No, oh, for sure. And we know that because we know humans. So we know what they do. And that's something too that I talk about a little bit, is the singularity, because it's so easy because of predictive programming and movies and things that we're gonna just get bionic. We're gonna get like all these bits and pieces and parts. But when you look at some of the research that's going on, it's a little creepier than that, even, because you have dish brains. I mean, there was just a story out this past week about neurons being able to learn to play Doom from a petri dish. Yeah. So
I'm here for that.
okay. So this is research that's been going on for a little while, and so but it finally came out as like a little like weird story, but it's actual research that's been going on for a while, and so there's even more to it. My view, and if I had to put money on it, we're not going to get more bionic. It's not going to be like the metaglass, like the Neuralink stuff.
Mhm.
I wouldn't even worry about that. I'm worried about the opposite, that the robot takeover is actually going the opposite way, that the robots, so to speak, that the technology, it becomes biological, because that's what they're trying to do anyway with these organoids, brainoids, and the dish brain kind of thing. And they're able to, there's quantum computing chips that are running off of human neurons. Like they put them in there, and it just, and what's wild about it is they're doing what you'd expect, because humans aren't necessarily rational. It takes a lot of like statistics to be able to try to get some idea of what a human could be capable of, say for economic purposes or marketing or whatever. It's showing to be the same thing. When you add neurons to silicon, you find that there's an irrationality, there's an unpredictability. And so that's kind of exciting. But then the question is like non-local consciousness, what are we doing? What are we doing? Are we putting are we going to be so mired in the question of is chat GPT becoming conscious, and we're not going to see that the other way around? Because what is consciousness? Nobody can answer that, of course. But is it going to be that it's like a chimerica of like completely a fake consciousness that it just fools us? Or is it going to be that really what happens is we have these advanced computer chips eventually that have just enough human brain capacity, because of actually being blended with like human tissue, that maybe is where we should be worried about like a soul being contained in. And it depends on where you think a soul, or if a soul resides. I mean, these are the ethical questions that get, I think, a little weirder. And nobody's talking about that, in my view, enough, because we're all worried about how spooky it is that like the large language models sound believable. And it's like, these are magic 8 balls that have been given to the plebeians. So like it's I mean, it's cool and all, there's potential, but that's not what DARPA is working with, trust me. So yeah, spooky stuff down the way.
Oh, I love spooky stuff. Spooky stuff is a great place to kind of leave people on their toes.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good place for us to kind of start wrapping up. So Heather, where can some of our listeners find more of your work? You'd mentioned you also have another book coming out soon, if you want to, tease that at all.
That watch for that one later this year and early next. But for now, we're talking about the Annunaki revelation. And you can find all my books and my information on my website, www.drheatherlynn.com. It's drheatherlynn, Lynn.com. You can also just plug me into Google or YouTube. I would say put the doctor in, not because I'm trying to be like some sort of like credentialed person, but literally because unfortunately the name Heather Lynn also pulls up a lot of OnlyFans content. So trust me, I don't have an OnlyFans. Nobody's paying to see that. I promise. It is basically just put that in, you'll find me. But my books are at Barnes and Noble, Amazon, anywhere that you can find books. And yeah, so looking forward to talking to you again sometime. Hopefully, it's a great talk and you guys are really fun. Have a lot of great questions.
We want to hear more about this next book when it comes out.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, so hopefully we get in contact with you and we'll see where it goes from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much for having me.